Good afternoon, everyone, y buenas tardes a los hispanoparlantes. Sé que tenemos muchos acá. Sean también bienvenidos. My name is Cristina Gomez. I'm the Assistant Director of the Tropical Conservation Institute at Florida International University. And along with our partnering panelists from One Earth Conservation, the Laboratory of Infectious Disease at the University of Georgia, Defenders of Wildlife Mexico, and the American Bird Conservancy, we would like to welcome you to the second edition of our webinar series, Wildlife in a Changed World. I'm happy to see so many tuned in. I think we have about 100 people online right now, so thank you for taking the time to come listen to our discussion session today on parrot conservation, where our speakers will be answering some of the questions our audience had in our first webinar on parrot conservation in crisis. Today we have the pleasure of having our 5 panelists from last week back. After a brief introduction of each of our panelists, we'll be discussing a list of audience questions focused on 4 main topics: bans and regulations, ecosystem services, community conservation, and management of captive populations. Our first speaker today is Dr. LoraKim Joyner, the co-director of One Earth Conservation. LoraKim is a veterinarian specialist and specialized in conservation medicine. She has worked in the front lines of parrot conservation in the Americas for over 30 years. And currently oversees projects in 8 countries in Central and South America. She has done an amazing job at also bringing the human dimension of conservation to her work as a certified nonviolent communication trainer and Unitarian Universalist minister. We also have the pleasure of having Juan Carlos Cantú, the director of Defenders of Wildlife Mexico. Juan Carlos oversees the organization's programs for parrots and many other endangered and invasive species. He has worked in parrot conservation for over 25 years, focusing on combating illegal trade of parrots in Mexico by advocating for more stringent regulations, educating the population, and doing in situ conservation. Internationally, he works with CITES to stop the unsustainable trade of parrots. We also have today with us Dr. Daniel Levin, the Vice President of Threatened Species at the American Bird Conservancy. Dan has worked in parrot conservation for almost 20 years. Him and his international team work with partner organizations across Latin America and the Caribbean to conserve parrots and other wild birds and their habitats. They have helped establish multiple nature reserves for the rare species, developed ecotourism facilities at many of these reserves to finance management, supported nest box programs to boost reproduction, as well as research to guide conservation and anti-trafficking and anti-prosecution campaigns. Finally, I would like to welcome Dr. Paul Reillo, our director at the Tropical Conservation Institute, and also the director of Rare Species Conservatory Foundation, our main partner organization. Paul's background is in environmental engineering and ecological genetics. He has been immersed in parrot conservation for over 30 years, spearheading in situ and ex situ recovery programs for a number of endangered species, including Brazil's red-browed parrot and the endemic Amazons of the Eastern Caribbean. So welcome to all our panelists and audience. We're now going to move on to discuss some of the questions we received last week. But before we start, I just wanted to mention that we have a Q&A chat where you can post questions. And if we have time at the end, we can attempt to answer a few of them. And please don't post your questions on the chat, since I won't be checking that one as we move forward. So our first question related to bans and regulations is from one of our listeners that mentions that some online articles state that blanket bans on wildlife trade are not the answer, while others say that blanket bans are the best solution to addressing the unsustainable wildlife economy. What do our panelists think? And post-COVID-19, should conservation organizations and scientists push for more stringent wildlife trade regulations and enforcement? These and our other questions are for all our speakers. So let's start with LoraKim and then go directly to the next one.
Thank you, Cristina, and hello, and buenas tardes a todos. One track that I want to take on it is we may not have an international, everyone has the same ban, but we have bans now. Most of these countries have made it illegal to export, all but 2 countries in the Americas for decades and decades. And then of course we have our various CITES regulations. So we have bans now, and we're still dealing with a whole bunch of legal and illegal trade going on with our parrots. We're still losing our parrots even though we have bans. So we do need the laws. I don't want to say that we shouldn't try to do them, but we also need all the other aspects in parrot conservation. We need local commitments. We need NGOs that are part of it. It's the holistic approach. We can't just rely on bans, and if we do some kinds of bans, we have to make sure we have an integrative approach, such as education and awareness, fieldwork, community support, sustainable livelihoods where we are. There's just a whole bunch that has to happen. And another thing about the bans, whatever kinds of bans that we may want to increase, is that we know that compliance for laws lags a couple generations behind, even with protection and even with the government enforcement of the laws. It doesn't really change behavior. So you have to keep the laws and you have to keep this holistic approach going for generations to actually get people to change their behavior. And so I want to also point out that part of this idea of bans is governments need help. You know, it costs money, it takes time, it takes capacity to actually enforce the ban. So we can't just throw a ban out there without doing this whole program behind it. And one of the things that comes with changing the behavior, laws can help change our behaviors, but so can cultural expectations. So if more of us say or model it's not okay to trade in parrots, that we're not going to do this, that actually puts a pressure to change, hopefully at a global level. And so it is a good time to look at the integrative approach of not just our laws, but funding and all of our various programs, because now is the time we can really focus and incorporate any kind of international ban into this. And gosh, Juan Carlos, I hope that you'll be able to just tell us a lot more about this now.
Yes, thank you. Well, I can tell you that bans really do work in Mexico. And I'm going to give you 3 examples. Crocodiles. In the 1960s, legal and illegal overexploitation drove Mexico's crocodile species to the brink of extinctions. And then in 1970, a total ban was decreed. Now all the species are no longer endangered. They have been downlisted in CITES and dropped from the Endangered Species Act. Now, with sea turtles, in the 70s and 80s, legal and illegal overexploitation drove all species to the endangered status. And in 1990, a total ban was decreed. Now all species, except for the leatherback sea turtle, are recovering. The olive ridley sea turtle that is found all over the world was downlisted from endangered to vulnerable on the basis of the enormous Mexican nesting population that skyrocketed after the 1990s ban. And with parrots, again, legal and illegal overexploitation drove all Mexican species to be at risk, with 11 endangered species, 7 threatened species, and 4 species under special protection. In 2008, a total ban was decreed. And in 2017, the Environmental Enforcement Agency estimated that parrot illegal trade had decreased by 24% thanks to the ban. Also, the scarlet macaw populations have doubled, and the total population has increased by 30% thanks to the reintroduction projects that could not have happened before the ban. The reality is that, I agree, bans do not work by themselves. They need to be accompanied by conservation projects, research, environmental education, law enforcement, campaigns to reduce demand, and alternative sources of income for the communities. So you have to really work on them for them to be able to really function, and they do function. And also, I do agree that we do need more strict regulations, especially regarding wildlife markets. And with illegal trade, we need to regulate sale of wildlife on the internet. Okay.
I think I'm next.
Yes.
Yeah, so thanks to the prior speakers. I think those are really good answers. So post-COVID-19, there's definitely an opportunity, I think, to increase and strengthen regulations that are out there. And American Bird Conservancy has already joined with other leading wildlife conservation organizations to call for a global ban on terrestrial wildlife trade, including wild birds, in markets as part of a response to reduce the risk of zoonotic disease outbreaks like Ebola and COVID-19, and also to reduce the ongoing huge scale of this trade that threatens wildlife worldwide. And personally, I've also been convinced that trade in wild parrots anywhere creates an environment and market that promotes this practice everywhere, from talking with my colleagues like others on this panel in the animal welfare space. And so even trade in parrot species with healthy populations can promote trade in endangered species. And most of the public does not differentiate much between different parrot species. In the US, there's a surplus of captive parrots compared to homes that can care for them. So additional trade just compounds this issue. And we really must address the cultural demand fueling this trade, which is, I think, similar to what other panelists have already said.
The only thing that I would add to this discussion is that we have a tendency to make a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to crises in wildlife. And certainly the pandemic has prompted that. We're seeing that across the board in wildlife trade regulations that are emerging as we try to interpret what they really mean. With regard to parrots, I agree with Dan wholeheartedly that incentivizing trade in common species really incentivizes trade in all. And while the commerce in particularly rare and endangered species has driven the illicit trade in parrots, what we have to remember is that bans are but one tool. The toolbox to address protection. And protection of parrots now is paramount. And it is incumbent on all of us who are in this field, both practitioners and scientists, but also lovers of wildlife, lovers of parrots, that we keep this argument front and center, that we make this a campaign for the intrinsic value that Dr. Ritchie just spoke of, where we're thinking of parrots as having an inherent value above and beyond whether or not they have a monetary value. Monetizing everything in conservation is not going to be effective for the same reason that bans are not effective, which is that we reduce the resource into a series of commodities. And in my opinion, where we've seen successes in protections that have been aggressive, such as prohibiting the private ownership of Appendix 1 species, particularly in the Eastern Caribbean. We're going to touch on this later, how that gave rise to amnesties and custodial systems for protecting wildlife and keeping that resource local. We also have to think about how those mechanisms that translate into sovereignty, into empowering local governments and range states to have control of their wildlife, wherever it might be. Just because that parrot may be in trade somewhere does not mean that the range state should relinquish control or relinquish autonomy over its wildlife. I think that sovereignty is something that is very important to us. Here in the US, well, I always use the metaphor of what if we had some other country captive breeding bald eagles for us, selling them into the pet trade, how would we feel about that? Those sorts of images prompt all sorts of discussions about regulation. But I think ultimately it comes back to what is our suite of tools to address protection in real time, and how much pressure do we put on the general public, on the governing authorities, and on the regulators as parrot scientists and parrot conservationists to make sure that these steps are effective.
Our next question is about ecosystem services provided by parrots, as Dan mentioned. And another listener said that beyond supporting tourism, parrots provide a whole suite of ecosystem services. Which ones do you guys think that can have a larger impact on supporting conservation efforts? So LoraKim, what would you like to comment on that?
It's a little bit about where we were going earlier with Paul and Brand's comment about what is the value of parrots. And we have this term called ecosystem services. And so, sure, we can say that they are primary seed dispersers, maybe of some kinds of seeds and sizes that only macaws can do. And that's really, we know that's important. There's some sense that their fecal matter underneath roost trees and other areas is soil enrichment, and who knows, a whole other host of interweaving contributions that we can't see. And so there is that, and that is helpful for some people. We use the term the parrots are the farmers of the forest, and that grabs people's attention about for ecosystem. There's also just a general sense that if they're there, they're part of a healthy system, and we need a healthy ecosystem to be resilient to climate change. And people get that right now in Central America, and I think up into Mexico too, Juan Carlos. There's hundreds and hundreds of fires. You know, we're losing parrots and parrot nest trees, and it's got a piece of the climate change going on there. So we need our parrots to combat climate change. And perhaps some of the things we don't talk about is the spiritual and cultural resources that these parrots are. The people, when lose their parrots, they don't see the macaws flying over anymore. They say if they can see their parrots flying free, they feel free too. And so these are all ecosystem services, but one of the most important ones that the parrots can offer for our communities is conservation employment. You know, the parrots are there, and so we need help managing them and taking care of them and studying them, and that employment is so important for converting groups of people to be thinking about the parrots, and plus it saves lives now. We are patrolling about 500,000 hectares in Honduras right now for employing with stipends about 100 people for what it would cost to employ one forest ranger here in the United States. And we don't want to take jobs away from anyone here, but what I'm saying is it's not that expensive, and we can share our resources and give people meaningful employment that saves lives now, just by some redistribution of our resources. And it increases social capital amongst the communities. They become a team. They're so glad of their work that they're doing together. And so this is what parrots are providing. And I just want to say something about ecotourism, especially with the COVID-19. Ecotourism does help a number of the communities that we work with, but it raises the question, do we want to be using fossil fuels to be paying for conservation? Do we want to do that? And so it calls into a question that we need to reevaluate how to get resources from where we are into the hands of the local communities, so that they can protect parrots where they are. And so just, we need to kind of rethink about this reliance on fossil fuels and investments in capitalism and profit to actually fuel conservation. And with that, Juan Carlos, what do you have to say?
Well, I basically agree with most everything that you said, but I'm gonna take it into another area, and that is that we must accept the fact that we don't have intact ecosystems anymore, and our natural reserves, especially in Mexico and in most parts of Latin America, they're basically reserves that are inhabited by people. Many of our reserves are just patches of forest surrounded by farms and cattle ranches. They're very different from the ones that you have in the USA or in Canada. I mean, local communities were there from the beginning or have encroached upon the habitat of parrots. In Mexico, we have communities that see parrots as crop and orchard pests. In fact, some communities would ask for permission to trap parrots just to get rid of them. And of course, well, this was never a good solution because authorities would only give them permission to capture a small number of parrots. So they would go ahead and capture as many parrots as they could illegally. But some communities didn't even ask for permission and would invite parrot poachers into their land. Now, research has been done that proves that parrots are not the main problem, but other birds, mammals, and insects are the main culprits of crop damage. The thing is, parrots are the most visible and loud, and they get most of the blame. And in some areas in the state of Oaxaca and Chiapas, parrots are still being killed and eaten. So, as bans and conservation projects are more successful in recovering parrot populations, we must address the issue of parrots versus farmers. The solution would be to find ways to discourage parrots from feeding on crops and orchards, or to find economic means to pay farmers for crop damage. And now I'm passing it on to Dan.
Okay, thank you, Juan Carlos. So yeah, as LoraKim was saying, yeah, parrots contribute to nutrient cycling and seed dispersal, which basically means moving seeds around that help allow trees to grow in new places. And then also, if you protect the habitats that the birds depend on, those habitats have a lot of ecosystem services in terms of protecting freshwater sources and carbon sequestration. But all that said, I don't think that the ecosystem service argument is often very effective. And this argument puts the onus of parrot conservation on what they can do for us and what they can do for the rest of nature. And I think, like Paul was saying, we can have a different perspective. To me, parrots are an amazing zenith of bird evolution. They're among the most colorful, intelligent, social, and long-lived birds in the world. And they have this intrinsic moral right to exist. So we must also win that moral argument that they're worth saving, because the invisible hand of economics just is not going to win that for us.
You know, I think we have to remember that there are animals on our planet that have achieved a universal status of fame, recognition, and reverence. And parrots need to be in that group. They afford just incredible leverage when we think of the great fraction of parrots globally that are now endangered or threatened, which is conservatively between a third and a half of all parrot species, which per take is 365 or so. And we look at the habitats that those parrots inhabit. If we just chose the top 50 highest priority parrot species on Earth and the habitats that they require, we conservatively save between a third and a half of all terrestrial species just by saving the habitat requirements of those top 50 parrot species. Those kinds of analyses are incredibly compelling, because it means that we've got the science behind us to show how vitally important these animals are as indicator species. They are the proverbial parrot in the coal mine. They're telling us where we're doing well, and they're telling us where we're doing badly. And where they're doing well, we see other ecosystem services. We see functional ecosystems. We see the integrity of a forest ecosystem. And globally, with these tropical species, we are seeing mirrors of what's happening in other taxa. So that's true in mammals, it's true in primates, it's true in reptiles, it's true in freshwater fish. And so what we're seeing with parrots is a very visible reminder that flagship species have conservation leverage, and that they have achieved that celebrated status that's data supported, that they are deserving of more than just being treated as commodities, and that we can elevate our understanding universally as well. That's at the local level, that's at the international level, that's for people who have parrots in their backyards, as well as people who don't. And to me, when we talk about ecosystem services, I think sometimes that can be a reductionist argument, where we're trying to boil it down to, well, what's the bottom line here? Why do we really need something? And that's not the conversation. The conversation needs to be, what do these animals represent? How are they tied into the greater trophic diversity and the biodiversity of our planet? And what have we learned along the way, both from cases where we've lost species as well as where we've recovered them? And of course, the overwhelming take-home message is that where recovery is possible, it's on our watch, where we've been able to achieve that, we prove that good things can happen for many, many other species. And that is that's the real gold standard here, is that parrots are not just a destination, a conservation destination of their own. They are the levers for creating biodiversity preservation at a very broad scale. Christina, back to you.
Great, Paul, thank you. So our next question is related to local community efforts to support parrot conservation. So what is a good strategy to do parrot conservation locally within communities? How do we teach people that parrots support local economies? LoraKim, what do you think?
I want to start with that word teach. How do we teach the others how to do things. That is an approach that here, at least at One Earth Conservation, we really try not to do, to come in that way. We use mostly the concept of popular education out of the pedagogy of the oppressed with Paulo Freire. We come in and we ask questions, you know, we show up and go, do you have parrots here? Do you like your parrots? What's going on with your parrots? Tell us about how you value your parrots, and what do you want to do about them? So it's very community driven and decision driven. And so that's the way we come in. We don't teach them anything. We come in and go, what can you teach us? And if we find solidarity and that we both want to help parrots in this area, then we combine our skills. And another way to look at this is this idea of ethno-ornithology. It means you come in and you embed yourself in the community and you study the way the people value the parrots. Nobody's wrong in how they value parrots. We just do it differently. But that doesn't mean we just come in and say, well, just go ahead and poach away. It means we come in and I might say, I lost the Carolina parakeet from my own country. I mourn for that. And I really don't want to see that for your children. So we're involved, but we share at an equal level. And I just want to point out that working with communities, and when they have investment and really want to do the work and they really have the buy-in that it comes from their own sense, is that the conservation outcomes are greater. And so we need to work with communities. And let me tell you, it's not fun. It's really hard. The multicultural skills that you need to traverse various cultures and your own triggers as you come in and watch the harm that's happening to people and parrots. But I believe this is really where the work is. And to work with communities, it's highly relational. You got to be in it for the long run, and you just have to keep showing up. That could be 90% of the conservation work, is just showing up. And we try to get involved in people's lives that are so messy, not just in their parrots. We relate to them as people, as we would want to be related with. And again, how do you work with the local community? We go back to the other question. Employment stipends are really important. People want meaningful work. And so we really need to be able to invest in the parrots by investing in the people. It's like, it's the book. Conservation, it's not about the parrots, it's about the people. That's really what we want to do. And again, the COVID virus brings up some of this for us about how important the local community is. In the projects where we have like upper managers or consultants or myself, for instance, we can't move. And so in those kinds of projects right now, things have slowed down. But where the local community live with the parrots, they can move around and they're still doing all the work. So we need to find a way to reconstruct the way we're paying for conservation and the whole system of funding, so we give the decision and the resources with a local community where they are, because they can do it. We just have to find a way to do conservation in that way, and the pandemic gives us a chance to look at what that might look like in the future. Oh, Juan Carlos, please.
Thank you. Well, the reality is that in Mexico, what we're doing is that we are promoting bird watching as an alternative to parrot poaching. We have been creating quick identification bird guides and provide them free to local communities. We have created more than 20 guides and have long waiting lists from NGOs, environmental authorities, and local communities that want them to start ecotourism projects or even educational projects. We also create comic books, coloring books, children books, posters, teachers' kits that we provide freely to those that are promoting parrot conservation with local communities. We have even translated one of our comic books to an indigenous language for the Triqui Nation in Oaxaca. This has had success in several areas, especially in those where there are ongoing projects that plan to work with the communities for a long period. For ecotourism projects that are just starting, it is very important that the women of the community take an active part in the administration of the new business. It has been our experience that with other projects that men usually lose interest and drop the project if they don't see a quick economic return for their time. While women do stick to it because it is important for them to earn money for their families. In most coastal states in the Pacific side of Mexico, parrot poachers are using children to take down parrot chicks from their nests. they pay them very little for their efforts, but they are corrupting them and teaching them to commit a crime. So it is important that any conservation or business project take into account the women and children of the area. But it is also very important not only to teach and convince local communities to conserve parrots, but also government authorities. Most countries have a very limited budget to protect hundreds of endangered species. And unless the government see parrots as important for conservation and for economic reasons, they will put their effort and funding on other species. Okay, so now it's we're going to Dan Levin.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. Local people often tend to know and love their parrots. LoraKim said that. And we support local communities in this thirst to foster a culture of appreciation through education outreach, including rare style campaigns now repeated elsewhere. And we spoke a little bit about that during the last webinar. And we listen to communities and discuss what the communities need. Maybe they will agree to help the parrot either by avoiding harvest or protecting their habitat in exchange for us helping them with some basic needs. Maybe in some cases we can provide compensation for crops lost to parrots, parrot pests, for example. So literally in these cases, a sack of corn could save a parrot by building tolerance in that community for some losses in agriculture. And then also training and visual aids for law enforcement officers at airports can help a trade. And so there's lots of different communities and stakeholders that can be reached in different ways. All kinds of stakeholders involved in this. And then, regarding economies in the question, I think we need to be really careful about saying parrots support local economies, because sometimes it's true with tourism enterprises, and in those cases can be effective, but sometimes with agricultural systems and parrots being seen as agricultural pests, it's not always true. And parrot tourism can help, but particularly it's most effective in a fairly small number of very special places. And so this isn't as widespread probably as it needs to be to compete or replace agriculture per se. And again, parrot habitat has a lot of value in terms of water resources and erosion control and these other ecosystem services we've talked about, but that's different from the parrots themselves. So again, we need to have public policies and leadership at the highest levels that Paul and Juan Carlos and others have been talking about that protect representative examples of our natural world, including parrots, because they do represent, to me, a really critical, important part of that and a symbolic part of that. So again, it gets back to that moral argument that we need to, that I feel like that moral argument's lost when you say you have to have an economic justification, even if the economics are in favor of parrots in some circumstances.
I think the world is now very unified in a way that it hasn't been perhaps since 9/11, where we see the ramifications of this crisis. It also exposes the vulnerabilities and the frailties of our societies and our systems. And one of the vulnerabilities that I think parrots help to explain is that in poor countries, in tropical countries, it's very easy for corruption and for bad actors to infiltrate and disrupt otherwise successful conservation efforts, not just with parrots, but with any species that has a high market value. We've seen this. We've seen case studies across the board. Every endangered parrot on Earth has been exploited in some way. And a lot of that was through trade, because these birds, as they become more and more rare, become more valuable. They're coveted. They're coveted much as artwork is coveted. And all sorts of nefarious acts are attached to the parrot trade. In addition to that, we have to recognize that poor countries are extremely susceptible to outside influence because these animals carry high value. And that really tells me that we've got, just like so many other problems in the human frame of mind, we think about immediate and then long-term ramifications. The immediate is I can get some money for this thing, so I'm going to cash out and sell this bird or catch this bird. The long term, of course, is that these are long-lived organisms. These are animals that require ecosystem stability. They require forests that have mature trees that can support nesting cavities. And the long-term view is at complete odds with short-term human greed. And that is what has driven the parrot crisis. It's greed. And it's greed that's infiltrated at all levels. It's not only by the consumptive greed of outside people and outside systems wanting to capitalize on birds, but it's also the greed that comes from being able to corrupt local governments and local players. We must do everything possible to deter that greed, to instill a sense of intrinsic value, but also to disrupt networks that give rise to that greed succeeding. And to me, that's what we have to call out these bad actors. And one of the things that COVID has reminded us, like so many other challenges in our planet, including climate change and disasters, is that behind every challenge, there's a team of greedy people trying to exploit and capitalize on that crisis. And I suspect that we're going to see something along those lines with COVID-19. I hope not, as LoraKim and Dan and Juan Carlos have nicely pointed out. We have strong armies of people in the field doing what they can while we're stuck here not able to assist them as much as we'd like to. But ultimately, we're going to have to bolster their ability to keep that work front and center, to keep it focused and to keep it recognizable, so that the world sees just how valuable it is. Well, what do the others think? I mean, I don't want to be negative here, but what do we do to stop corruption? What do we do to deter bad actors in the parrot conservation game?
Well, I would like to say something here, because a lot of people think that the problem with parrot poachers is that the local communities are doing the poaching. And in reality, in very many places, it is not them that are doing the poaching. Poachers come from other communities, from neighboring communities. In some places in Mexico, they even come from a different state, from several states away. And also with communities that are on the border of countries, poachers can come from another country to poach on the parrots on the community. And the problem is that to face off the poachers, it has to be the community themselves that has to stop them, because there's no authority there, never, ever. I mean, federal authorities, state or local authorities are never gonna be there to stop the poachers. So you have to rely on the community to do that work. And the only reason for a lot of communities to do that work is if they see parrots, not only as intrinsically important or culturally important, but if they see parrots as ways to get some income, not by capturing them, but by bringing in tourism or whatever, they're going to be more willing to face off the poachers. Because in some places, they have tried and they have failed, because some of the poachers are very violent. And to risk their life for something that you really don't have, don't put any value to it, it's very difficult.
For that, and I think that this discussion leads us nicely into our next question, which has two parts, one related to amnesties and another to management of captive birds. So I'd like our panelists to focus on either or questions. And the first is, what do we do with the current captive population of parrots? We want to educate local people, encourage them to appreciate and protect their local species. But in the meantime, should we be working more closely with zoos? And the second part of this question is, when parrots are confiscated by government, they are sent to a zoo or a rescue center. The rescue centers are overwhelmed with parrots. So should we risk putting birds back in the wild which could have a negative impact on the wild populations. How effective are amnesties? So LoraKim, what do you have to say about that?
I don't want to keep up any type of negative tone, Paul, that maybe you brought in about how hard this is. But the captive bird situation, the rescue bird situation is a mess. It's a mess. And conservation is an art, it's a dance. It takes commitment with our partners. And so no one can say that these stakeholders know how to do it, or we know how to do it, or this is perfect. And so that means we need a holistic, integrated approach involving everyone we can, including zoos, ranch owners, businesses. Everybody's a part of the solution because everyone's part of the problem. But having said that, we really need to find a way to be with unknowing and the messiness and the pain and the loss of conservation with parrots, and that's our rescue centers. There's no really good solution, but there are some things that I have found that can mitigate it. And one of the things that we can do is our rescue centers have to exist in the countries where the parrots are. If we don't, the governments or the local people, the authorities will just take the birds, and they want to take them anyway, and they'll just give them away or shut them off here. They'll go into a collection, or they'll do something with it where the birds don't have a good life. And so we have to have rescue centers, and it works because the governments trust, the authorities trust it, and will start bringing birds. And it's a way to employ people, and it's a way to get the government to start to be held accountable to delivering the birds. And these rescue centers don't have to be expensive. If you work with people, we basically release birds. It's not the optimum, and I said it's messy, but we can release them healthfully and with success out of people's backyards and in small cages being built. Because where the people are locally, they can care for the birds, and there's the wild flocks already there that they can release them into. Yes, there's the risk of disease. Maybe we're introducing novel behavior and vocalizations. Maybe there was one study where they moved Amazons around from one dialect to another, and the parrots not immediately, but quickly learned the dialect of the other. So it's our hope that when we're releasing birds that have been confiscated as chicks, or even adult birds, that we're not doing much harm. But here's some other ways that we can mitigate some of this messiness, is work with the governments, the authorities that do the confiscation, and ask them not to confiscate birds that will be more miserable and suffer more if you take them from their homes, where maybe they've been living with the people for 30 years. Maybe they're blind and can't see. And so we work with them and say, yeah, bring us the chicks. We can release those quickly. But if the bird is going to be healthier and happy where they are, work with the people where they are in their homes, give them a strong conservation message, maybe find them, and say you've got to improve the welfare of your bird. But we're not going to just start picking up all these birds and going into people's homes. And so we have a program, we call it Welfare Brigades, where we go with the government and we go into people's homes. So we don't confiscate all the illegal birds. We help work with people, and we ban the birds, and we keep track on whether they're bringing any more birds in. And that's one way to kind of mitigate the messiness of the rescue centers. And there's a lot more I can say, but I want to hear from some other people. Juan Carlos?
Yes, well, I'm going to tell a little bit about what happens in Mexico. And when a shipment of parrots is confiscated and the authorities are sure they were captured locally, they can proceed to release them in the area. Unfortunately, this is a very rare situation. Most shipments consist of parrot chicks recently taken from their nests, which cannot be released. And many shipments are confiscated very far away from the area of capture, sometimes as far as 1,000 miles. So these chicks will never be released because authorities can't know with any certainty where exactly they came from. And they don't have the funds to pay for rehabilitation and transport them to the area of origin. The reality is that even when a shipment of parrots is given to a rescue center to provide veterinarian services, medicine, food, and day-long care, most of the parrots will die anyway because they have undergone a long process through the illegal trade of bad nourishment, sickness, dehydration. They are trampled by other parrots, or they get bruised and wounded through mishandling by traffickers. Parrot traffickers don't take care of parrots at all because they deal with quantity, not quality. They don't care if most of them die, because once the parrots pass from one part of the chain of illegal trade to the next part, it is not the problem anymore. Once a parrot trapper sells to a hoarder, he doesn't care if the parrots live or die. Then the hoarder sells to a transporter, and then the transporter sells it to a distributor, which in turn sells it to local vendors. And none of them take care of the parrots. They just hope most of them survive to be sold to the next in line. We estimated that up to 77% of all the parrots taken from the wild will die before reaching a customer. And 90% will die within a year of being sold. So basically, what happens is that whichever parrots reach a rescue center, most of them, the immense majority, will die. And here in Mexico, at least, rescue centers are not cheap to maintain. And we believe that most of the effort should be put in stopping parrots from being taken from their habitat in the first place. This is much cheaper to do and has a better outcome for the wild populations. And now to Dan.
Thanks, Juan Carlos. Absolutely, it's a lot more cost-effective to conserve wild populations of parrots in the wild. And so that's what American Bird Conservancy and our partners are doing to make sure there's some safe places left for these birds flying free. For the question that was posed, I'm going to try to tackle more of the amnesty side of those things because, like others have said, a lot of parrots cannot be released. So amnesties can help authorities understand the numbers and distribution of captive birds. And they register these birds just like we here register cats and dogs. We could do the same thing for wild and threatened species. And this can help those authorities provide better care to those captive birds. Maybe some of those birds aren't receiving really good vet care, and they can provide that as a service. And further aid in enforcement and trafficking, enforcement of trafficking by easily separating the known amnesty birds from new birds that have not been registered and all of a sudden show up. It's much easier for the authorities to differentiate which birds are to be worried more about. And which birds have just been captured from the wild versus other birds maybe have been in captivity 30 years and they're accounted for. And there's a really good example of that going on, or that has just been completed recently in the Cayman Islands. And that was modeled after other programs in the Caribbean that Dr. Paul Reillo knows a lot about. So amnesties can help. I mean, it's another tool in the toolbox. None of these are silver bullets, but it's another interesting tool in the toolbox to be considered.
So here's the big parrot in the room. There are millions of parrots in cages around the world, and the vast majority of those are kept in cages that are nowhere near where that species came from. And that defines what is the parrot industry. One of the universal themes that cuts through that tragedy is that the people who have those parrots consider them property. And that is part of what fuels the whole discussion in trade. When we talk about captive parrots, what we're really talking about is control. And I think it is undeniable, not only among parrot conservationists, but among conservationists in general, that it is ultimately deplorable and unconscionable to imagine removing wild parrots from their native populations to put in cages for any kind of conservation activity. I can't think of a single species where that would be justified today. And yet it's still going on, and it's still being argued as a case for so-called collectors or collector conservationists to do what they do. Now, having said that, we have this huge reservoir of parrots being bred in captivity, being sold, being owned, most of them ex situ. What do we do with that? And the question of zoos and management. To me, we have to recognize that there are going to be parrots in captivity for a very long time, if not forever. And therefore, how we cope with that situation responsibly, recognizing that they are wildlife, wherever they are, is the paramount concern. And so, yes, we do need to call on facilities that manage particularly ex situ parrots to manage them responsibly and to make sure that they're not contributing to the greater greed fest of owning and proliferating parrots as pets. And the promulgation of parrots as cute companion animals that can ride bicycles and talk and make us feel special because we have them. That responsibility comes at the institutional level. But we all know that the vast majority of parrots are owned by private individuals internationally. So how do we call on those folks to have a higher understanding of what it is to have a rare parrot or have a parrot in their house? So here I'm calling on those institutions that have the capacity. Don't just manage the species in your care, genetically and demographically. Help build the capacity for in situ management as well, because where there is recovery, there's rehabilitation. And where there's a rescue center, there's an avenue for rehabilitation. And those facilities need capacity locally. We don't need to spend more money fueling the captive parrot trade in far-flung countries when the in-country players are desperate for the resources to manage their own wildlife. And that means veterinary care, that means transitional care for birds that are coming in that are fledglings that can be weaned, rehabilitated, and released. It's also doing the responsible thing to make sure that you're tracking pathogens, you're tracking problems in real time, but most importantly, it gets that control back where it belongs. Those parrots belong to those countries. It's their sovereignty, it's their wildlife. Let's give them the tools they need to keep their wildlife home, to value it, to save it. And the ex situ populations, which very well may exist for forever, can be managed responsibly without there being a hard connection between those populations and the source populations fueling those ex situ populations and draining the wild populations of parrots.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that comment, Paul. And we have a question that we received from one of our audience related to parrots, to social media being flooded with images and videos on parrots, and parrots being treated as human possession for entertainment. So I wanted to know if any of you would like to comment on that, or if you have any final words on parrot conservation that you would like to share with us today.
You know, I'll go. Maybe we can do all the last comments in the same order. I think the question comes down to, is this the way we want to live as people? Do we want animals in cages? Do we want people oppressed and basically imprisoned? Do we want to live in a society of greater inequality and based on our consumption and the unequal resource use that we have? Do we want to live that way? And so I say no, none of us want to live that way. So when parrots are flying free, when they are with empowered people that live with them in holistic communities as well as we can, we free ourselves no matter where we are in the world. And so we don't do this for other people and for other parrots. We do it for ourselves because they are symbols and they are beings that have all the value and all the ability to live flourishing lives if we would just leave them alone and support them. And so the question about the social media, it all has to do is how do we see the world? And we hate to be politically correct and be corrected on that. There's shame involved with that. But you know how many times people correct me for having slides that even show an animal like on a leash or a bird in a cage? It matters how we look and just let it out of our vision that it's okay to imprison animals, parrots, and people. And it's not okay. It's not okay for them, and it's not okay for us.
Yeah, I would like to comment that one of the problems that we hear and see a lot of the time here in Mexico is that people think that when they buy a parrot, they are saving it from extinction. They are saving it from dying. And they just don't realize that when every time they buy one parrot, it means that 4 other parrots have died in the process of the illegal trade. And basically, whenever they buy one parrot, they're just fomenting the illegal trade, because the trafficker, once they get money from selling one parrot, they just go back and capture more parrots. And people just don't understand it. They think, well, it's one parrot in my home. We've always have parrots in Mexico. That's a cultural thing, so it's okay. They don't understand all the damage that they're doing just by buying one parrot. And we also hear from people outside of Mexico, especially in the US and in Europe, that all the parrots that are being sold are basically good for the conservation of parrots. And that is not true at all. None of those parrots are going to come back to their countries of origin. They're not going to help conservation at all in any way whatsoever. And so basically, the countries of origin have to face the problem that they are losing their native parrots, not only to the international trade, but to the domestic trade. So we must tackle both trades, international and national. We must reduce demand of parrots in Mexico, in Latin America, in the US, in Europe, and everywhere. That's the only way we're going to be able to stop the trade and to save the parrots.
Thanks, Juan Carlos. I think that honest and competent leadership is absolutely essential across societies to favor good public policy towards the goal of parrot conservation and towards the goal of public health, and away from corruption, away from dramatic inequality, away from the risky endeavors that have led to disease outbreaks. Parrot extinction is just one failure of this leadership. So at least us in our country, we need to vote, we need to be active, we need to write our representatives and make our voices heard. And until that leadership arrives or changes dramatically, people, our listeners, can support NGOs and our partners where parrots live to hold that line and buy time for parrots and help, in some cases, those parrots recover where possible. So that's where we are now, and that's what people can do now to help.
I want to take this opportunity to thank the panelists and their insights, because I've been privileged to hear their views both within the webinars and outside, and I want to tell you personally how much I've enjoyed your insights and your intellect, and I know that our listeners have also. And by extension, I want to thank all the people who are in this field doing wildlife conservation in this very challenging time, and particularly our partners on the ground in the field that don't get to speak out as much as we would like them to. They don't get the voice that they deserve. And all I can tell you is that it's our pledge, each of our organizations, the people that you've seen in these webinars, are committed to making sure that the resources that we generate hit the ground and go to those partners so that they can do their jobs better. So one of the tangibles that we take away from this session, that we recognize that the problems are vast. They're huge, they're looming. They're multicultural, they're conflicts that we're not going to resolve in discussion, but they help illuminate opportunity, particularly when the world is unified and at least recognizing that something is terribly wrong. And that is that we can join together and we can help the people that are doing good work. We can encourage them to expand what's working well, to explore the successes, to apply them without being cookie cutter, but being case specific, to see what works and where it works, and to build a stronger network of professionals, of educators, of decision makers, and of a vastly more enlightened public, so that at the end of the day, wildlife benefits and we all benefit. So on behalf of the Tropical Conservation Institute and all of us speaking here today, I just want to thank everybody for listening and for chiming in and contributing to this session. And I've really, really benefited from it personally. And I look forward to the discussions that will come from this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. And before we conclude our webinar today, I wanted to mention that we have received many requests for bilingual content, and several of our panelists have great links to resources that they're willing to share. So we'll collect those and post them on our website, tci.fiu.edu. There you will also find contact information of all our speakers if you'd like to reach out to them to continue the conversation. And please join us again next Monday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a third edition of Wildlife in a Changed World. We'll have Dr. Sue Lieberman from Wildlife Conservation Society, Dr. Vanda Philbert-Brown from Brookings Institute, and Dr. Paul Reillo from Tropical Conservation Institute talking about wildlife trade policy. The Zoom link and other information about that webinar will also be on our website, tci.fiu.edu. So once again, I'd like to join Paul in thanking all our speakers for their wonderful insights on parrot conservation. And on behalf of all of our partner organizations and Tropical Conservation Institute here at Florida International Year, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in today. Gracias a todos por venir, and have a great day, everyone.